Okay, so thank you for joining us. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Neil Duncan, who's an associate professor at the University of Central Florida and directs the Paleoethnobotanical and Environmental Archaeology Lab. Dr. Duncan studies the interrelationships of food, culture, and environments in the past. His current work focuses on the Llanos de Mojos of Bolivia and Cape Canaveral, Florida, but he has worked in Peru, Ecuador, Mexico, Colombia, and China. Thanks again for joining us, Neil, and I will stop sharing and let you take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Jamie. Let me just get this started here. Okay, are we good?
You're good.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. I've been working with a colleague here at UCF since I was hired in 2015 by the name of John Walker. And he pulled me into the Amazon when I was hired. And I'm kind of glad he did, because it turns out to be a fascinating place to work. And I'm happy to get the chance to talk about what I've been doing recently. So thank you so much, Jamie, for this invitation. Excuse me. Excuse me, pardon me. I had a flu shot this morning and my throat's been kind of scratchy ever since. So I'll try to make it through. So I wanted to talk specifically about a small region of the Southwestern Amazon called the Llanos de Mojos of Bolivia. But before I do, I want to put this relatively small region into some kind of geographical and archaeological perspective, because, hold on just a second, here we go. First of all, the Amazon basin is big. And when I say big, I mean it's really big. And it's not a homogeneous environment. And there is, and there was, a huge diversity of cultures and languages that have inhabited this region for thousands of years. And archaeological research in this area has been slowly building over the last few decades or so. However, when most people think of South American archaeology, what comes to mind are these famous examples of cultures, such as the Inca Empire, that I'm sure you've heard of, based in Cusco, Peru, that stretched across the Andes from northern Argentina all the way up into Colombia. And of course, you've heard of Machu Picchu and Ollantaytambo, possibly, and the fantastic architecture that's associated with this culture. Or maybe you've heard of Tiwanaku in the highlands of Western Bolivia, or perhaps even Chavín in the Peruvian highlands, which had a huge influence over much of the central Andes many, many, many years before the Inca did. And I should add too that people at Chavín de Huantar utilized Amazonian plants and animals in their iconography. So the point is that these cultural developments that are occurring in the Andes tend to get a lot of attention archaeologically, and a lot more attention than what was going on in the Amazon. And also those images that I just showed you highlighted some of the architecture that these cultures are famous for. And these kinds of elaborate architectures are almost completely absent in the Amazon basin, with the exception of some sites on the eastern slopes of the Andes. However, there are plenty of signs that people were making some really large-scale transformative impacts on the landscape, and those are starting to become clear. And many archaeologists feel that these may need to be considered as equally important developments in terms of South American archaeology. So the image I have up here is another image of the Amazon basin on the left here, and I'm highlighting this recent research article from 2018 led by Jonas de Souza in Nature Communications. And in this paper, they model these earth-building settlements along the entire rim of the Amazon basin. And these include earth and ceremonial mound centers, mounded ring ditch inhabitations, large platform mounds, even fortified settlements. And they're not limited to just the major river valleys, but they're actually dispersed along minor tributaries and interfluves. And the numbers of these sites and the locations that these sites are in strongly suggest that the Amazon sustained very high population densities that rivaled really anywhere else on the continent. So when we imagine the Amazon, we often think of this dense kind of green vegetation that's infested with animals and insects that are set out to kill you, kind of like Florida. But in the past, when population densities were a lot higher, the landscape probably looked quite different. And sometimes these sites, we don't see them from the ground. They're often invisible, even when we're standing on them. But we can sometimes see them from space or from aerial photos. And sometimes the sites are just completely obscured by the forest canopy. Michael Heckenberger, who over at University of Florida has been working in the Xingu region of Brazil, and they've been documenting networks of towns that are linked by roads and causeways and small settlements that were packed together in clusters of communities. And each one was acting as its own political unit. And that sounds a lot like how modern towns within states operate. So kind of gives a pause for thought there. So we really have to look for the signs that humans were active in the Amazon, but often when we do look, we see that evidence just about everywhere. And at this point, I think I can shift to talking about Mojos in particular. This is an aerial photo taken by John Walker from a shaky plain. It's a slide from, well, it's a film slide, it's not digital, which is why it's a little bit grainy. But what we're looking at are large raised fields, and these crisscross the Mojos region. These are human-made structures, along with things like fish weirs and forest islands, and they cover approximately 100,000 square kilometers. And if you get on Google Earth and you dial down to the region of Mojos, these are one of the most distinctive features of the landscape. And one of the central questions that archaeologists have had about this region, basically ever since there was aerial photography, is what are these things for? When were they built? And what was grown on them? Because the assumption has been that they're raised fields, and I think that's a fair assumption to make. And there is some data that supports that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And our data from this project, our most recent project, provides somewhat of a clue as to when these might have been constructed and what they were used for. So this map helps us to orient a little bit better where the Llanos de Mojos is situated in the southwestern region of the Amazon basin. So in its entirety, just to give you an idea of scale, you could fit probably about the state of Florida in here. I think Florida is around 170,000 square kilometers. And this region is about 135,000 square kilometers. So we're still talking about a big area here, with probably a lot of cultural diversity. The area in white on the map on the left that's surrounded by gray, that's the Yacuma and Rapulo tributaries of the Madeira Basin. And this is the area where we do most of our research these days. The largest modern town in this region is Trinidad, and that's home to about 130,000 people today. So it's not a big town, but outside of this town, the region is quite remote, and it's very sparsely populated. The region is sparsely populated today. However, that may have more to do with native depopulation after the arrival of European diseases and forced abandonment beginning in the 16th century, and later the tragic economy of the rubber boom in the late 18th, early 20th century that expanded a lot of colonization, a lot of European colonization in the region. So populations here that live today are very different, and indigenous peoples have had a very difficult time maintaining traditional lifeways. Here's another aerial view that I hope helps with some scale. The white dots on the bottom right are cows. You can barely make those out, but they are cows. And these large patches of green are examples of forest islands. And these are patches of vegetation that dot the savanna landscape. And forest islands are slightly elevated above the savanna, and that makes them very important culturally, but also ecologically. Around 75% of these forest islands, or perhaps even more in this region, were inhabited in the past. And they're also important respites for animals during the wet season, which I'll show you why in an example in a minute. So you'll notice that there are raised fields here too, and note the size of these. These are big. Some of them are in excess of 100 meters long or more. And in this case, they're situated right next to forest islands where people were living. In this case, the San Francisco Forest Island. So when you look at this landscape, it looks really dry, but in fact, water plays a huge role in shaping this environment. And during the wet season, the Llanos de Mojos kind of acts like a bathtub, if you will. And this is kind of a dramatic couple of pictures of a forest island during the dry season on top, and then the same island during a wet season, during the inundation during the summer, which in South America is December through April. So it's the inverse of our North American summers. And during the summer months, this intensive rainfall essentially can't be drained fast enough. The rivers are already slow moving, the Yakuma, the Rapulo, the Mamori rivers, and they start to overflow their banks and water just builds up and it floods almost the entire savanna here. So as you can imagine, this seasonal inundation really shapes the local ecology quite dramatically. But it's also very predictable. So people living in this region would know exactly when and how the floods will occur. And as we're coming to understand, people developed ways of mitigating this natural phenomena to their own benefit. And this started very early, a few thousand years ago. And based on climate data from Amazonian coring that's done by our colleague Bronwyn Whitney, the South American monsoon that really brings all this moisture to the Mojos appears to have strengthened to its modern level sometime around 6,000 years ago. So we think this is an area where people have been living there for 6,000 years, and we think this is a great place, and an important place where we can understand how people managed with changing climate and a changing landscape as a result. I mean, this is something that we're dealing with in Florida in our own lives. And thanks to Hurricane Ian, we've seen plenty of examples of flooding, especially and even around here where I am in Orlando. So this is our laboratory, so to speak. This is the Quinato wetland in the heart of central Mojos. It's a largely permanent wetland that varies by season, of course. So in other words, it expands considerably during the wet season, but then recedes and stays wet during the dry season. And on this map, there are 4 forest islands. And in fact, there's a few more forest islands that aren't labeled on here, but these 4 forest islands are the ones where we did some small scale excavations that kind of put the wetland into a cultural context. But what I'll highlight here and talk about a little bit more are the 2 sediment cores that we took in the upper and the lower end of the wetland, the Mercedes core and the Quinato core. And these cores are about 22 kilometers apart. And although we have evidence on this landscape of humans dating back at least 6,000 years, when forest islands have been excavated here, we see that the radiocarbon dates cluster between 200 to 1500 AD. And that may be the result of preservation, but also taphonomical issues as well. But our understanding for environmental change over time really comes from these 2 cores, and I wanted to talk about those just a little bit more. So coring is a way of getting sediment from the bottom of wetlands, in this case, the permanent wetlands here in Quinato. And we used a modified Livingston core built for us by Jason Curtis at UF, and that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you. It's the process is really simple, though. It's basically a polycarbonate tube that you attach to rods that enable you to push the tube into the sediment at the bottom of the wetland, then pull it out. And if you think about, when you're a kid, or you can probably do it now, you put your thumb over the end of a straw in your drink and you pull it out and the straw is full. Well, that's basically the process. So the sediment comes out and we split the cores in half, and there's an example in that photograph there. And what comes out is a discrete record of sediment that forms at the bottom of the wetland over time. And pollen and airborne charcoal land on the water, and that sinks to the bottom. Phytoliths of plants that lived along the edges or nearby get washed into the lake during the wet season, and diatoms that are living in the water die and they settle to the bottom. So they give us all these proxy records for climate and ecology. And it's fairly easy to obtain. And like I said, the Amazon is really big. but our data are really small. This is an image of our field laboratory that we set up in a tiny town called Santa Ana de Yacuma. And from the cores, we sample stratigraphically, and we isolate phytoliths, pollen, diatoms, and microcharcoal. And I'll explain what those are if you don't know in a second. And all of these are identified and counted, or with particulate charcoal simply counted. And each of these indicators tells us slightly different, although complementary things. So some of you might be familiar or might be unfamiliar with these indicators, and some of you might be more familiar. But I'll explain these sort of quickly. And phytoliths are opaline silica bodies that form in the cells of plants. And these can tell us about the more immediate local environment. So what was growing and dying nearby. Phytoliths were processed at my lab at UCF. And pollen, you know what pollen is. You have probably, if you're like me, you have a relationship with pollen that's not too pleasant. It makes you sneeze. But pollen is really the reproductive male gametes of seed-producing plants. And these tell us about the immediate environment, the plants that are growing around, and also the broader ecology, because some pollen types are wind dispersed, and the kind of pollen that you find covering your car, for example. So our colleagues Bronwyn Whitney and Nick Logan at Northumbria University in the UK analyzed the pollen. And diatoms, finally, are a type of single-celled microalgae with skeletons, if you will, of opaline silica. It's the same mineral as phytoliths, and they preserve in a similar way that phytoliths do. And these can be identified by their skeletal structures. Diatoms are kind of cool. They form communities, and the communities vary based on the aquatic environment. So they need water to live, of course, and they can be indicators of water quality, as well as indicate whether water is permanently there or is intermittently there. And in our case, this makes them very useful. So Emma Hocking, also at Northumbria, analyzed the diatoms. I don't include a photo of microcharcoal, but I think you can imagine what that might look like. It's small and black. But the relative amounts of particulate charcoal provide a pretty good indication for how much and for how long burning was a part of the landscape. Humans, as we know, are major producers of particulate charcoal, and that applies for the past, especially because people were doing things on the landscape, clearing land, but also cooking food, and that involves fuel, and that produces a lot of charcoal, and that charcoal can get into sediment records fairly easily. And Nick Laughlin, our colleague at Northumbria, counted thousands and thousands of particulate charcoal in the samples. So the image on the left here shows a modern wildfire on the savanna at night that I took a photo in 2018, I think. Yes, 2018. And today, burning on this landscape is practiced by ranchers to clear brush to promote pasture for cattle. The idea is to clear the land of vegetation, and that promotes a quick succession for grasses that cattle like to eat. And cattle is the major modern industry here. And this kind of burning of the landscape is very, very different from indigenous burning practices. This kind of burning covers a wide, expansive area, and could be quite damaging to all kinds of vegetation, not just the grassland that they're trying to regenerate. In the past, and as we know this from indigenous practices ethnographically, cultural burning was far more selective, much smaller in scale, and oriented to very different goals. And patchworks of forests could be maintained to create openings for animals by small burns to remove shrubbery, but also spare the trees, which are highly valued resources. And also burning would have been used to prepare raised fields for cultivation, for instance. So charcoal particulates in relative abundance in sediments where people lived in the past can tell us how much burning was being done. And that would then correspond to anthropogenic activities like clearance for farming. All right, so what do these indicators mean? I always hesitate to put graphs like this in a presentation because explaining them, well, they just beg explanation. They're not obvious to anybody looking at them, and even myself. I see one of these graphs and I'm immediately drawn into them, and it takes minutes, sometimes longer, just to figure out what's going on. But I'll try to sort of summarize what's going on here the best I can. So this is the Mercedes core that was taken at the top of the wetland. The age and the depth of the core is shown on the left columns. And the black horizontal bars, those indicate charcoal counts by depth. The orange bars signify phytolith counts. The green bars indicate pollen, and the blue bars indicate diatom species. And I'll show you the other core in a second, but both of these cores demonstrate fairly similar patterns, which you might expect because they're only 22 kilometers apart. But they're significantly different, and I'll try to explain that in a second. So the savanna landscape is most indicative here by the poaceae, the grasses that appear in the phytoliths. What was unexpected is that these two cores are only a short distance in the same wetland, but they show that the wetland becomes permanent at different times for each core. And this is indicated by the presence of preserved pollen, those green bars, which does not preserve well in dry environments, and the appearance of water-loving diatoms, those blue bars on the far right, who also don't like dry environments. So in the Mercedes core, you'll notice that there's no pollen and there's no diatoms from the bottom half of the core, whereas there's phytoliths of savanna going all the way back to the bottom. So chronologically, the Mercedes core reaches down to about 5,500 BCE, which is about the last 7,500 years. But evidence for a permanent wetland forming here is demonstrated only around 1750 BCE. And diatoms and pollen and this increase in charcoal correspond, and there's a phytolith evidence of agriculture around that time with the appearance of maize and squash. So human activity is present with the change from dry to wet. So we have a very clear association with sustained burning and agriculture and also permanent water. So this is the Kinato core, which is the other core. It's weirdly named the Kinato core because this is the first core we did. We named it after the Kinato wetland, and then we went back and did another core. So this became the Kinato core. But anyway, there's a similar pattern at the Kinato core, but a very different time scale, where that permanent wetland corresponds to pollen preservation and diatoms and increases in burning. So prior to around 1200 or 1260 BCE, the phytoliths show a very dry savanna environment with a strong arboreal signal, so lots of trees, and they contribute a lot in the bottom part of the core, but then the arboreal phytoliths decrease dramatically, and then particulate charcoal increases very dramatically. And, excuse me, and the core indicates that by around 200 AD, diatoms are present in abundance and pollen is being preserved in abundance. And the conditions here then sort of match those conditions at Mercedes. It looks like a permanent wetland here associated with sustained burning from human activities, but it occurs 1,000 years or so later than it happens at Mercedes, just 22 kilometers away. So John Walker created this cartoon diagram that explains the data, and I think in a little bit more effective way. I kind of like this. So in the first panel, around 4100 BC, the woody savanna dominates the landscape, as the Mercedes core indicates, and with some burning that's occurring. But it's unclear whether this burning is anthropogenic. It could be natural, but there are people here, so it's probably anthropogenic. In the second panel, by around 1700 BC, there's a permanent wetland that forms at the very top of the Kinato, where the Mercedes core was taken, that dark green spot up above where it says B1. And fire becomes more intensified to levels that indicate much stronger anthropogenic activities happening here. In the third panel, by around 200 AD, the permanent wetland has formed all the way up to the Kinato core. And here is extensive burning in both locales, and there's clear evidence for ongoing agriculture now. And then by 1500 AD, cattle have been introduced to the region, and the depopulation is occurring, and the abandonment of forest islands is also occurring, and then the regrowth of the forest island vegetation is starting. Okay, so I led with this image in the title screen, and I want to return to it again because this is some artwork that we commissioned from an artist, an archaeological artist named Catherine Kalaki, who is a trained archaeologist, but also a fantastic artist. And she looks at our data and she looks at our aerial photos, and she recreated what the Kanado wetland might have looked like around 200 CE. And I think it's absolutely fantastic. I think it really captures exactly what we're trying to explain with our data. So we believe that the changes that we see in the hydrology of that wetland, can only be related to human modification of the landscape. So with climate change alone, the hydrological changes should have occurred at the same time in both locations. They're only 22 kilometers apart on a very flat savanna, by the way. Yet it begins around 1500 years, 1500 years earlier at Mercedes than it does down where we took the Kanado core. And the presence and abundance of fish weirs and raised fields that we can see and map from aerial photos and drones today, these kinds of features can retain water for fish, and they can also drain water from raised fields. So this is a hydrological management system that's happening here. And fish weirs, and in the foreground of this picture, you'll see a person standing wearing a white tunic on top of one of these fish weirs. Fish weirs have been widely mapped throughout the wetland by Walker, and this is they're becoming a focus of research for an undergraduate honors thesis right now, but also our own interests as well. And there's also raised fields here that are abundant throughout. So I want to reiterate that what we have here is a complex system of landscape domestication that peoples of Mojos incorporated with raised fields, agriculture, fish weirs, vegetation management that's informed by extensive burning. And all these things are combined signals of an integrated water and land management strategy that begins as early as 3,000 years ago. And our data that raised fields could have been used over the last 3,000 years suggest they're a bit older than we expected. Our data does not confirm that raised fields are that old, but it confirms that raised fields could be that old, which I think is kind of an important thing. So I want to turn back to this question of raised fields again, simply because they really have been a focus for archaeologists in the region. And we have an indication from the wetland coring that raised fields, they may go back to 3,000 years in this part of the Amazon basin. And it seems like a really simple question to solve. Just date the raised fields, right? I mean, just go to the raised fields, excavate them, get some radiocarbon and date them. And well, people have tried that, and it's actually very, very complicated. And the reason is, well, there's several reasons for this. There's very little ethnographic account of raised fields because at the time when Europeans arrived to the region, depopulation of indigenous peoples due to disease was already happening, and those existing peoples were being moved into Jesuit missions. And so they were taken off of that landscape. And so that knowledge about how raised fields were used just was never recorded. So we don't have clear examples of how the raised fields were used to grow crops. And also because of the way that raised fields were built and used, and the stratigraphy of raised fields is really discontinuous. If you can imagine, a raised field is built by excavating and mounding soil onto it. You're excavating a canal, you're mounting the soil on top of the raised field, and then you're planting on it, and the floods come in again, and your crops get replanted in the next year, and the floods recede, and the floods come in, and the floods recede, and you plant and you grow and you harvest, and that cycle goes on again, and then the canals are cleaned out, and more material is put on top of the raised fields and cleaned out and put on top of the raised fields. And this process happens over and over and over again. You multiply that by hundreds of years, the stratigraphy of raised fields becomes really jumbled up. So getting a good idea of where to take radiocarbon samples to date the raised fields has become very problematic. So our cores just provide a tiny clue until we can develop a better method for dating our fields directly. We have a grant proposal in right now to acquire a portable OSL, so optical stimulated luminescence machine. We call it the magic dirt machine that we'll take to Bolivia after some training to figure out how to use it. And that might give us some results. But for now, our coring data just provides a clue that, well, maybe raised fields are 3,000 years old. Maybe they're not, but that's okay. So what was grown on them? So we can't really say how old raised fields are yet, but can we say what's grown on them? This has also been kind of problematic. From pollen and phytolith studies done by people like Ruth Dickow and Braun and Whitney and Jose Iriarte and others, we have some idea about what was grown on the raised fields, but it's not complete. There are economic crops such as xanthosoma, you might know as malanga if you have relatives in the Caribbean, for instance, or you've probably heard of ilex. This is yerba mate in South America, but it's also grows here, a different species called ilex vomitoria, or the Yaupan holly that was the source of the black drink that was important to native cultures of the Southeast and here in Florida. There's also bixa or anato or achiote that was used for pigment and spices. There's maize, of course, that was evident in raised fields from pollen and phytoliths. And there's Inka species. So this is a fabaceae, this is a tree, a bean tree, basically, and they produce these pods that have this edible pulp in them. They're really delicious. They're called the ice cream bean, and they're called the ice cream bean for a purpose. It's what they taste like. And also they're sweet potato. But even though some cultivated plants have been identified directly on raised field context, we're still missing a really large part of that economy. I think I mentioned before already that pollen isn't preserved very well in dry context, so raised fields are dry when they're sampled. So a lot of the pollen from cultivated plants may not survive and doesn't get preserved, and so it's not identified. And so those plants aren't in the archaeological record. And there's also several really important crops that don't produce phytoliths that otherwise would be preserved in dry environments. Root crops, for instance, like manioc, or as we know it as yuca, if you're, again, a Caribbean food, and some other root crops. So those are absent from the raised field context. So the question is, what are they grown on the raised fields? Well, we don't really know that yet either completely, but we're trying to figure that out. But I think excavations on forest islands has kind of been the key to identifying some of the other crops that could have been growing on those raised fields. And this is a photo from one of the forest islands that's adjacent to the Quinato wetlands, is the Miraflores forest island that we did some test excavations here in 2019. These are examples of some of the ceramics that were excavated in forest islands around the Quinato wetlands. Now, ceramics, of course, they're useful in archaeology for establishing chronologies and other kinds of cultural information. But there's been some novel research that's been done by Danielle Young, who was a recent UCF MA, who was able to identify some of the plants that were processed using this kind of pottery by looking at the microscopic residues on the surfaces. And most of us, I think, are familiar with starch in some way or another, but we maybe have never seen what it looks like under a microscope. Now, starch grains are the energy storage for plants that are produced during photosynthesis. And some plants store starch in the roots and the tubers or the rhizomes for seasonal growth, or they can accumulate starch in the seeds or the fruiting bodies of the plants to support germination. So potatoes in the roots and maize in the fruits, if you think about it that way. So starch is energy, and starchy plants are the primary targets for humans to eat, not surprisingly. So if you also think about potatoes, domesticated in the Andes, or sweet potatoes, or yuca, or manioc, domesticated in the Amazon. So starchy foods have been part of human diet going back to our earliest ancestors and beyond. Now, fortunately for archaeology, starch grains can be identified I want to say fairly easily, well, we can identify what a starch grain is, but sometimes it's a little more difficult to identify a starch grain to species unless they have a very characteristic shape and morphology. Under polarized light in the sort of the right-hand sides of each plant in those photos, they exhibit sort of a cross shape that you can see in the examples here. That's a unique feature of starch morphology. So the analysis of the ceramics that Daniel Young did from these 4 islands, the Santa Maria, Estancita, Miraflores, and San Francisco. So all of these are adjacent to raised fields. And this study identified really quite a rich variety of starchy foods that people of Mojos utilized. And these, of course, include those domesticates like manioc and maize, but also a number of roots, including arrowroot, achira, sweet potato, yam, and fruits from squash, beans, and also annatto. And there's also a large number of unidentified starch types that represent, additional cultivated plants that still may not be known yet. So this research identified one other plant that I should mention that no longer grows in the area that was of some interest when she discovered it. This is Aracacha. It looks like a carrot, and if you say it looks like a carrot, you're making a pretty good guess. It's a root in the carrot or the parsnip family, and it's still a crop that's grown today in the Andes, primarily in highland Ecuador or mid-elevation Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. But it also grows or cultivated in the Caribbean. This plant was domesticated in the mid-elevation eastern slopes of the Andes, so it's not an Amazonian crop, but its documentation here in Mojos makes it the first archaeological evidence for it in the Amazon, and I think it's some of the only archaeological evidence of it outside of the coast of Peru. So this is kind of a novel find. It's sort of interesting. It's not cultivated today in the Amazon, but there are wild forms found on the eastern slopes that still exist today. And it may have been traded in, or it could have been grown here. Farmers in Mojos may have overcome any of the botanical limitations that existed for this plant to grow in a different environment like the Amazon rather than the mid-elevation Andes. And I bring this up because it has a Florida connection. So experiments in the 1950s with this crop, people were thinking it could be a successful cash crop. Here, they reported that it just didn't develop roots very well when they seeded the Aracacha plants. However, in South America, most cultivated Aracacha is propagated from root cutting. So I think it's not Florida farmers' fault, but I think they just weren't doing it right. And that's probably why it didn't work out very well. Nevertheless, it is grown commercially in southeastern Brazil. So that's it. So that just says, well, okay, it can be grown in the Amazon, and it seems to have been grown in the Amazon. So its past use really underscores that notion that and this kind of underscores the whole notion of this talk, is that our modern understanding of what crops are utilized or cultivated or traded or otherwise obtained in the Amazon is really limited, and it highlights the importance of further research into past people-plant relationships in this region. So just to sum all of this up, the data from our sediment course can help resolve these differences in environmental history between locations that are separated by only a few kilometers, strangely enough, as people began to domesticate the landscape for this extensive use of resources. We're able to document thousands of years of landscape domestication in this region. But really, in order to understand that relationship between long-term ecological histories that we can reconstruct from pollen, from diatoms, from phytoliths and charcoal data, and even human activity. And this requires that we ground ourselves archaeologically in that archaeological data, such as the starch grains from plants on ceramics that are used by people living in forest islands right next to raised fields and fish weirs. There's a human need for food, and food was central to the lives of people in Mojos, just like anywhere else. And this landscape here was visibly and permanently transformed in order to grow crops and harvest fish. And these foods were then transformed again when they were cooked and eaten by people who were living on the forest islands. So when we step back and we look at the Amazon today, what we can easily see is what native peoples in the region have already known, and that is humans are an integral part of this landscape and have actively shaped it for thousands and thousands of years. And we're only, I hate to use that archaeological pun that we're only scratching the surface, but there's so much more that we need to know. And that'll come, we hope. And thank you. I'll end with that slide.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your research. Very, very interesting. Glad you finished with the sloth. Very cool.
It's obligatory, right? It's the national animal. Well, it should be the national animal of Bolivia. It's not, but it should be.
What is? If a sloth isn't, then what is?
I don't recall. I want to say it's a llama, but
well, that's a good one too, I guess. All right. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat and we can get some going. I'm reading one now. Okay. Dr. Anna Gingrich says, very interesting talk. I would like to know more about what you learned about the use of fire from your data from the cores. What was it used for at the time? And also, it appears to be correlated with the permanent spread of wetlands. Was there any connection there?
That's a fantastic question. Yeah, so the fire, we can't look at the microparticles, the charcoal microparticles, and tell exactly what the fire was for and exactly what people were burning. But the correspondence with other changes going on in the wetland really suggests an increase in anthropogenic activity. And so when we think about what people were doing with fire and why fire would intensify, and that could be an increase in population, so that would result in more burning, more people burning, an increase in landscape intensification or agricultural intensification. I hate to use that word intensification when it comes to agriculture, but increased land management practices associated with growing food. So more clearing of raised fields, for instance, more burning of off. I should maybe point out that this landscape, there's no stone available in this landscape, and stone tools are fairly rare. And so we don't think that people were chopping down a lot of trees, for instance, to get their fuel. So we think fire is a way for maintaining field clearances that attract animals, also for, like I said, burning off of brush from raised fields. Once they get returned from fallow and go to agricultural again. So that increase that we see in those cores that is in correspondence with the other indicators of landscape change, the diatoms and the phytoliths and the pollen, just suggest what those activities might have been. And so I can't answer that question specifically of what people were doing, but that's the gist. That's sort of my idea of what they're doing. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you for the great question. And anyone else, feel free to type them away. I'll ask one.
Sure.
Are raised fields common elsewhere in the archaeological record, or are they still used today?
Good question. Yeah, so raised fields are fairly common in the archaeological record. So not just in the Amazon. So in this part of the Southwestern Amazon associated with forest islands, raised fields are really abundant. But if you go to the north, raised fields are not so abundant, where we have large mounded centers, very large sites with human habitations that aren't associated with raised fields. So that raises a question about how many people these raised fields are growing food for. But raised fields are common around Lake Titicaca, for instance, up in the Andes near Tiwanaku. And some work by archaeologist named Alan Collada years ago did some attempts at recreating some of the raised fields for modern agriculture. And there are raised fields or sunken fields on the coast of Peru. There are raised fields in the Maya area. There are raised fields. It's a very common way of dealing with seasonal landscapes where water is predictable in such a way. But it also has other kinds of benefits for growing food on them. So it regulates soil temperature, and it regulates and creates microclimates for plants to grow. So yeah, there was another part of that question. Did I answer both of those?
Yeah, I think you answered it. Thank you. All right, we have some other questions coming in. Chandler Birchfield would like to know, has there been XRF used on the soil sediments to better understand specific anthropogenic activities in the area? And then second question, earlier you showed a 2018 article displaying site types in the region. Why do the platform mounds seem to be concentrated in this specific southern area and not like more widely distributed in the region?
Okay, so the XRF question, I don't know if XRF has been done. It hasn't been done by our team yet, but that is a potential that we could use to, especially with ceramic materials and sourcing clay. Although it might be kind of difficult because that environment is the savanna environment is fairly homogeneous, and so the layers of clay there, for instance, are fairly homogeneous and spread for miles and miles and miles. So direct sourcing might be a little bit difficult. But so to answer the XRF question, I just don't know if it has been done or not yet. The other question, why the platforms mounds are clustered there, I can't answer that either. I would have to look at that paper again and see if they had an explanation for that, but that's a reasonable question.
Thank you for those questions,
Sure.
Chan. I was interested in your portable OSL machine. That sounds very cool. So
Yeah,
is it like the size of a PXRF or
I
bigger?
believe I haven't seen it in person, but I believe it is about that same size. And I have to admit, I don't know exactly how it's going to work in the field, whether you have to, when you're excavating, you have to cover yourself in a sheet and take the sample that way, or if you insert the rod and pull it out and keep it continuous where you can sample it with the machine. I don't know how it works yet, but part of the purchase comes with training. It's built by an archaeologist in Scotland, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name right now, but they build and they train you to use the machine, and they provide that kind of support. So, fingers crossed, if we get this grant, one of us is going to learn how to use it. And it provides us some really interesting data.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Might have to do some nocturnal archaeology to, but I think that might be a pretty good method to get at the age of these. And you mentioned the difficulty in radiocarbon dating.
Yeah, that's the reason we're shooting for it. It's a very expensive piece of machinery, so we're shooting for that in order to finally get some kind of resolution on how old some of these race fields are, or at least a few of them, right? So we'll see.
Okay. Has anyone else used OSL to date agricultural infrastructure in the Americas?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not entirely up on the OSL literature of the Americas, so, but I would not be surprised. Yeah. Well, you have, or are about to.
Me?
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, I did get some OSL dates for the first time ever, and they were okay. um,
it's a broad range of possible date that you get from it, but
yeah, I mostly was looking at storm overwash in an estuary. which, why would you want to date that? But so we got some OSL dates and they turned out pretty good. They made sense with our radiocarbon dates,
Mhm.
but I haven't dug too much into the OSL literature, fortunately. That was a question by Anna Gingrich, who
Okay.
I'm not sure if you know her, but she works next door in Peru.
Yes, yes. We are actually, I didn't talk about the Cape Canaveral research much here, but we are probably going to do some OSL dating next year. It's something that the archaeologist Tom Penders is really interested in. So that'll be kind of a test case also.
Cool. Yeah, I know there's some geologists did OSL dating out there 10 or so years ago, maybe longer, but just to see the age of the island. So getting more fine-grained dates would be really great.
Yeah.
Dr. Nancy White would like to know, or she said first, wonderful stuff. Thanks, Neil. And she would like to know, did they dig canals too?
Yes, canals are present on this landscape, and especially towards the north. So in this region where we're working with the raised fields sort of act as canals, but there are canals as well, and they're quite extensive. So yes, to answer your question, canals are a thing, and they did dig them.
And so they used the raised fields too, but between the areas as for travel too. How different are they in terms of like size? Can you just be that's a canal versus, or is it just because they're between fields?
Well, there are remnant canals in that wetland, for instance, that are still wet, and they're still used by people today to get from island to island. And people actively clean them out in order for them to maintain water. So when you look on Google Earth, I mean, you can get on Google Earth. I wish I had an example to show you immediately, but if you get on Google Earth and you scroll around, you can see the raised fields, and then you can see connecting canals that link to the river where water comes through. It's pretty fascinating.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, the raised fields are varied in pattern and size and distribution and clusters, and sometimes raised fields are built on top of raised fields. And so people are very, very clever about water management, and these are essentially hydrological experts that have modified this landscape in such a way that really benefited them, and really importantly. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's all the questions. So I want to just say again, thank you for sharing your research. It's awesome. And thank you everyone for joining us. So yeah, thanks again.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks, everybody. This was fun.